So our last two speakers, so George and Liam, are going to talk to us about print, or at least books, or this kind of thing. So one is going to talk about CSS and XSL-FO, and the other about EPUB. So, George.
Thank you, Mohammed. Hi again. My name is George Bina. I'm from a company called Syncro that develops Oxygen XML editor. My talk now will be about CSS for print using XSL-FO. My colleague Dan Caprioara actually worked on these ideas, so I'm just presenting this part. Our motivation for looking into this is that while XSL-FO is a good solution for obtaining print output, it has one big problem: customization. And we have quite a lot of requests on our support channels, people asking about how they can customize specific things in the PDF output. And there is no generic output that will satisfy everyone. So you don't have a solution to say, look, this is a PDF output and everyone will be happy with that. So that's the main problem, and the problem derives from the fact that a typical system that generates PDF through XSL-FO uses XSLT. So if you want to customize that, you need to know a number of technologies. So you need to have some knowledge about XSL-FO. The XSL-FO is generated from XSLT. So you need to know XSLT. And you have also this indirect layer because the XSL-FO is generated. And that will be okay, let's say you learn these technologies, but then you have the problem that you need to understand the system that actually, the workflow that's triggering this conversion. So in case of data, for instance, you need to understand the data open toolkit, how that works, and plug your changes as a data open toolkit plugin, and so on. Plus, you need to be aware of how that XSLT is developed. You know, how it was designed, what you can overwrite, which templates. Maybe you copy some of them. They are maybe big and you copy the entire thing and you change just some pieces of that, then the new version will change that template or will change of the processing workflow will change that. And your changes will break or do something that you do not expect. So that's the main issue, that you don't need to know only these technologies, you need to know the system and how the XSLT that will process the documents was actually designed, and if it was designed for extension. So I don't think in general there are, you can count probably the number of people who can actually do these customizations. So while XSL-FO is okay, it's good, we need to find an easy customization layer to be able to actually use it. And one idea will be, why not use CSS as the customization layer for XSL-FO? And that basically will give you a CSS to print processor that goes through XSL-FO. So to understand why this is better than replacing that XSLT with this CSS part, is that the conversion to XSL-FO is one module which does not change based on the CSS. It's the same for whatever CSS you have. And with CSS, you do not need to know how the existing CSS was designed to be able to overwrite a font or how the text is aligned or colors and so on. In the worst case, you just add an important, we make the rule more powerful if it doesn't do what you expect. Also, CSS knowledge, it's easier to find, I would guess. So just to give you an idea of the complexity involved, I'm just going through a few customizations. Here, the top part of the document is defined with this page media extensions for CSS. So basically, we have the top left corner, the top left part with the title, and the top right with the page number. This is the most complex part, probably. Now, if we want to have titles with a specific font, here we have an import that gets a font from Google. Then we just say make title bold, use a blue color, and use that font. And before section title, we put a counter, right? So that's all you need to do that. And I was saying about overriding that. So if you want to override, if that's the default behavior and we want title centered, then we can just say text align center on the titles. Or that first part removes the generated content, the number for the sections. In order to add a watermark, it's basically adding a background image is all you need for the specific pages that you want to mark as draft, confidential, or whatever. Putting your content on 2 columns, it's 2 lines, right? So it's quite easy for someone with basic CSS knowledge to look at some examples and create such a file. So I hope I made my point that customizing PDF through CSS, it's really a lot easier and from a practical point of view, possible for many people. So now, comparing CSS and XSL-FO, because if we want to convert from one to the other, we need to look into how this can be done. There are a number of similar properties, but there are also differences. And I'll just highlight a couple of, let's say, impedance mismatches between the two. Let's look here. For instance, in the CSS page media, you have for the page definition, around the main area, you have quite a lot of number of regions that can be addressed. While in XSL-FO, you have only 4 regions, right? So when you convert from one to the other, then you need to take this into account. And for instance, the solution is to generate a table in the region before with 3 columns to match the top left, top center, and top right from the CSS. And for the sides, for instance, generate an FO container with different content and with the size and height. You can basically put them to be the same as the CSS regions. Also, that rule there says for sections, use a different page type, a section page, which has maybe other properties. And that implies that in your document, the section may be in an article, but the article may use the default page type. The section needs to be on a different page. And that means that you need to kind of split the content and whatever is, because XSL-FO does not allow this nesting of different page types. So you need to take parts of the document and slice it into different parts, that each part will go on a different page type. Another example is if you have blocks in CSS, basically if you have a block that will translate usually to an XSL-FO block, but if a block in CSS has a specific width, in XSL-FO you need to use a block container. And that's fine, but text alignment for block containers is not relative to the parent block, let's say, or ancestor block. It's relative to the ancestor block container. So you need to take all these differences into account and make sure that what you generate on the XSL-FO side matches what you have in the CSS, basically, because that's what you specify. Also sometimes, like for form management, it's not enough to generate something in the CSS, in the XSL-FO, but you may need to, in case of Apache FOP that we are using, you need to generate also a configuration file, for example. And there are also some differences between XSL-FO as a specification and what it says and what a specific processor implements. Right, so in our one example is that Apache FOP does not support relative align equals baseline, for instance. Just an example. So although that's in the specification, from a practical point of view, you cannot rely only on what the specification says. You need to take into account also what the XSL-FO processors actually support, or the processor that you are using. So a more an overview of the processing that we do to obtain that is in this diagram, which basically show that we take as input an XML document and the CSS style, and then we annotate the XML with the CSS information, with the based on the what styles match from the CSS document. Then we slice the document based on the different page types. And on this annotated and ready to be transformed document, let's say, we apply an XSLT transformation to XSL-FO. And then that XSL-FO goes through the FOP engine and we obtain the PDF. So the annotation step will add attributes in a particular namespace to elements with the CSS properties. Then you have generated content from CSS, right? Before, after, you can push like that section number. And for that, we generate elements, again, in a specific namespace that will hold that content. And then we need to generate from that page media information that define the structure of the page. We need to generate that information so we can use it further in the conversion process to XSL-FO. Just to give you an example, so if we have an article and a rule that in CSS that says display this as a block, the annotated document will contain something like CSS column display equals block. But this will be applied for all CSS properties, right? Similar annotation. In this case, we have a title, and before the title, we add a label title column, right? So that translates, so the title gets the CSS display equals block annotation. And then, as a child, before the actual content, this is indented for, right, there's no space before title, column, and processor, but in the real processing. But I just added an indent so you can see better what's going on. So before the processor text, which is the content of the title, you have that CSS before, which contains a CSS text with that label, with that generated content. And the page metadata that I mentioned will be something like, so we take the page rule and size A4 will generate CSS property width and height with the corresponding values. And the margin will generate margin top, margin right, left button with those properties. So here we need to take into account, like defaults. If you see on the other slide for the section, there are like a default font maybe that's application provided, or implicit rules like, if you don't have a display, it's in line, or if the element contains a block, maybe it will get a block display. Also the parent will get a block display. And inheritance of different CSS styles. Also, you need to take into account different media that may specify screen, print, right? So you need to take into account only the print specific and ignore screen rules, for instance. So slicing the document, so after we annotate the document, we will slice this based on different page types. So now, because from one document with one root we can get multiple fragments, we wrap everything into a container element, and then we slice the document. So maybe here, I don't know if I don't have a pointer. So basically, you can see we have CSS root, which contains the CSS pages with the page meta information. And then, thank you, Sid. Oh. So we have the CSS root, and then the page meta information. And then, in this case, here, the section contains CSS page, section page, right? So the document needs to be split here. So we have a CSS page that contains the first part, then we close the article, then we open again the article and include a section which has a different page type, then the other section, and then the rest of the document will go into another page type container, right? And now, after we have this, the entire information from the CSS is now in this annotated document, which is split and ready for the XSL-FO conversion. We apply an XSLT processing, which, as I said, is the same for any document, because the processing is not based on the actual element names that you had in the original document, but on the styles, on the CSS annotations. Right, so the entire XSLT processing, like for instance, we don't care what the element name is. If it has a display inline, we generate an FO inline element and then apply the processing on the rest. So this will not change, right? So the only thing when you will customize will be the CSS. And as I mentioned, there is the conversion will generate, along with the XSL-FO, will generate also an FOP configuration file, like for the font to be able to handle the different fonts, we need to generate also the FOP configuration file, and those two will be the input for the FOP to generate the final PDF. Now you can use different CSS engines. It happens that we already have one in Oxygen, so we use that to get which styles apply to each element to obtain those annotations. And we can take advantage also of some advanced functionality like column has, so you can look inside an element, so you can match on a section which has a title and do something else, maybe change the styles. And we also implemented an XPath extension function, which can execute an XPath expression basically on the document. So you can do, in this example, for instance, I use the Oxy XPath to count the number of words and the number of characters on paragraphs. We support also multiple levels of after, and so you can say after 10, after 12. In this way, you do not get an exponential explosion if you want to combine different things based maybe on attribute values or things like that. So you can have different layers of before and after. And the document will look, basically you see it will generate something like number of words and number of characters after each. Because it's static content, it will go there. But this allows basically to do all kinds of generated content in the PDF if you want to. There are a number of existing CSS processors which are basically related work to this in a way. But I don't know if they go through this internal XSL-FO step. They are like black boxes in general. And there is this CSS to XSL-FO project, which is open source. But in the last 6 years or so, there's no activity on that. It went to some point, I think, but not to to have something like useful in the end. But it's an interesting work. I don't know why it was stopped. It was quite interesting. So I think my conclusions for I gave up for the work conclusions and I use takeaways. So I think CSS is really a really simple configuration layer that can be used for print, and maybe it will not solve very advanced requirements that you may have for the print output, but in many cases it will be enough. There's also the possibility to post-process that XSL-FO, generated XSL-FO with another XSLT style sheet to implement more advanced functionality, which is not possible through the CSS configuration in case you need more. That annotated document may be converted maybe to something like Patrick presented 4 years ago at XML+Prague. He has a more advanced engine. I don't know. That annotated version may be also an input for that, because I discussed with him last night, and the configuration is also difficult in that case also. And so far, as we work through this, although there are these differences, we managed to find solutions for every problem that we found along the way. So we hope to have this available for you in Oxygen 19 in April, so you can play with it. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Question, remarks? Oh yeah. Liam And John Lumley.
George, you might like to look at my paper in Balisage this summer, which is called Approximate CSS Styling in XSLT. And we've used a technique that's slightly similar to yours for a number of things, including things like the product data sheets from Saxonica. The idea is you take the CSS, you transform it into, surprise, surprise, an XSLT transform, which then works out and computes what the style value should be for the appropriate pieces on whatever you're going to produce, typically in, let's say, a piece of HTML that you then convert into FO. And then you end up with a piece of FO that you pass through the Oxygen FOP implementation to get the output. So, and that handles normal standard, what you might call textural styling. It handles added content, it handles nested counters. But if you go and look at that paper, you'll find chapter and verse on how it's done. And it's very, basically it's a bit like yours. You take your internal CSS engine to decorate what you're dealing with. Mm-hmm. We take the CSS and compile it into a transform, which we then run. So we don't have our own CSS engine. Mm-hmm. It does exactly that. So you might want to go and have a look at that.
Yeah, we didn't know about that, but it's interesting to look into that, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Liam? Oh, okay. Oh. Liam was first.
Liam was
fine.
Okay. I have a question like regarding practical usage of this approach, because we have a couple of frameworks which work with XSL-FO. We have a couple of actual formatters which support like CSS formatting directly from XML. Well, they all paid, so probably the only approach I see, if I'm not missing something, that we can use CSS and use and can use with Apache FOP, which is free. But how about like complex publications like technical documentation and so on? Because FOP doesn't solve all the problems. We can provide simple outputs, but when we need like hyphenation, pagination, page breaks, and all that stuff, so we usually need to use like commercial formatters. Thank you.
Well, basically this processor gives you access to the FO document. Now if you want to pass that through a commercial formatter, that's fine. I mean, it does not require Apache FOP, right? So you can use those paid,
those paid formatters usually support directly formatting from CSS to PDF, using CSS to produce PDF. Like Antenna House has CSS, while PDF Reactor, it can, Prince XML, they can work with either HTML or XML directly. And now we just introduce one additional step, which is probably complicates things a little bit, because of incompatibilities between FO and CSS. So, like, practical value from this?
Well, it depends on your requirements. So we think that there is a good number of users which will be happy with what they will get through this. If you have some requirements that are not solved by this, then there are other options.
Yeah, Liam Quinn, W3C. I'm really interested in this, and one of the things that interests me a lot is the differences between what you can do with FO and CSS. And for a while, I've been exploring, I haven't got very far, I've been exploring writing a program that takes an FO instance and produces HTML and CSS instead, that you could run through a CSS formatter. And my goal in doing this is partly to understand the things that you can't do with CSS that you can do with FO, to help people migrate and write a migration guide. But I don't know whether what you're doing would help with that at all. But I think this comparison, producing a comparison of what you can do in the two methodologies would be a very useful thing to achieve somehow.
I'll keep in mind if we find, a problem that we cannot solve, maybe that's something that's of interest, then as to be recorded as a difference.
Peter, you wanted to say something?
Okay. I have been doing a rework from XSL-FO to Print's XML+CSS. And the main reason for doing that was that the customer wanted to have one production street for the HTML pages and the CSS pages, the PDF pages. And you can reuse a large part of the HTML work for your PDF work if you go via HTML+CSS and then to page PDF. So that would be a large benefit of taking a tool like Print's XML or CSS plus page media anyway.
Sorry, I was not able to follow.
Okay. Well, I have been doing...
I don't hear very well also.
Okay, I'm not speaking well, so that's a bad combination. I have been doing a rework of XSL-FO to XML plus HTML plus CSS in order to have both.
Similar to what Liam said.
Yeah, in order to have both
HTML
versions.
in that case plus CSS.
But it's cheaper for the customer because he has two publications for one price.
For us also, it's interesting that if you, from the point of view of Oxygen itself, also if you customize something with CSS, you have that customization, the authoring part, but you can reuse it also for the PDF publishing. So that's also an advantage from that point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is